Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. This is just going to be an update video for my Three Sisters garden planting method. I made a video last year describing the way that I planted my Three Sisters garden. I did a very similar thing this year, but a couple tweaks. And in that video, I said that I was going to update on how things had changed. So that's basically what this video will be. So if you want more specific information about the history of Three Sisters gardens, why they're great from a permaculture perspective, the history, including kind of the indigenous context, you should watch my video from last year because I go a little bit more in depth about like the history and why it's good and all these kind of things. The simple summary is just that the Three Sisters garden is an ancient indigenous agricultural method of growing corn, beans, and squash together. Corn, beans, and squash grow very symbiotically with each other. They provide for each other in ways that are useful, so it's a good system of growing. Corn, beans, and squash are also very nutritionally compatible with each other. They all store very well. They can be eaten fresh or stored or dried for the winter. And it's just a good way to make efficient use of space as well, which is a primary reason for me because I'm growing in raised beds. I'm in an urban setting, so I'm basically just trying to maximize what I can with my space. So last year, my growing was pretty successful. Some things did better than others. I've sort of modified my layout according, which I'll go over in the next part of the video. I compare the diagrams for the planting that I did last year versus this year, just to give a summary of what happened last year. The corn did really well. Planting a couple corn all super close to each other ended up going great. The thing with corn is that it needs to be pollinated by another plant. And so a lot of times what people will do is they will go in and they'll actually pollinate by hand and like rub the little corn silks together or whatever to make sure that the corn pollinates. I did not do that. And I had no problem with the corn pollinating, even though it was such a small plot of only like 12 corn plants maybe. I also had corn growing in the side bed of my yard, and I didn't have any issues with cross-pollination between the sweet corn that I grew in the Three Sisters bed and the other variety of corn that I grew on the side of my house. So that was also great. So yeah, I would say the corn did very well. The only thing with corn, it was my first time growing it, and I didn't know how small the fresh corn harvesting period is. I really should have been like checking the corn periodically to see when a good time to harvest it would be and make sure that I was on it, because I kind of just let it go and I was like, oh, whatever, I'll harvest it when I want it. And as a result, a lot of my corn was kind of too dry for like the ideal sweet corn fresh eating experience. This year I will be more diligent about harvesting corn at the right time. Also, I would say if you are growing a much larger Three Sisters plot, it might be a problem for you because I think the ideal Three Sisters situation is harvesting kind of everything at the same time if you're not growing in a smaller raised bed environment. Like if you have an entire field of Three Sisters planting, it would be really difficult to actually get through and harvest the corn at the right time if the beans and squash weren't ready, because it grows really dense, which is a great thing. It's a great use of space to grow the three crops together, but it definitely makes it harder to get through. So for me, it wasn't a problem because I was just growing in like a 4.5 by 9 foot raised bed. So I can get in there, I can harvest what I need to. It's not a big deal. But I think if you were working with a larger space, you might want to use a variety of corn that you actually want to dry instead of using it fresh. So like an Indian corn or like a decorative corn that's meant to be dried, rather than trying to harvest the fresh sweet corn while your beans and squash are still like doing their thing and growing all over the place. That's just a consideration if you're not doing raised bed or like small gardening like I am. But all in all, the corn did super well. I'm very happy with how the corn turned out, and I used the same variety of corn this year. Moving on to squash. I planted way too many squash. I was just overambitious. I really wanted to have all the different varieties. So this year I only planted 3 squash plants in the same like amount of space that I did last year, whereas last year I did like 5 or 6. And I just want to try to actually like make sure that those plants have enough room to grow rather than trying to cram everything together, because I would rather have a couple plants that do really well and produce really well than have a bunch of plants where like some of them die because they don't have enough space and it's just kind of like a mess. So definitely reduce the number of squash plants. I'm curious to see how that goes. Beans. The beans did super well. Last year I started the beans after the corn, squash, and sunflowers, which was the way to go, and I did that again this year. So what I did was I basically put in the corn, squash, and sunflowers as seedlings, and then I direct sowed beans. It gives the corn a chance to actually grow up before the beans start vining on it, because if you start them at the same time, then what's going to happen is the beans are just going to totally overtake the corn. So by direct sowing the beans after the corn was a little bit more established, I think that worked really well, and the beans grew up the corn. They grew up some of the sunflowers as well. The beans were doing amazing. I used the same kind of beans, Scarlet Runner beans, again this year. I'm looking at my garden right now, by the way. That's why I keep like looking off camera, because I'm like looking at the raised bed. And then the last thing is sunflowers, which is like the fourth sister. A lot of people will include sunflowers because it's a pest deterrent. So like squirrels, birds, etc. will eat the sunflower seeds instead of eating the corn. I definitely found that to be the case. The squirrels were going crazy over the sunflowers. Like they would steal entire sunflower heads, like just straight up rip them off the plant, which is insane to me, and I have no idea where they put them. I'm very curious to see if I get like volunteer sunflowers in weird places this year because of wherever the squirrels took the sunflower heads. Definitely the sunflowers did their job in terms of being a target for pests instead of the corn. I didn't have any problems with the corn being eaten by pests, and that's pretty good because, as I said, I'm gardening in like an urban context, so there's plenty of urban wildlife here to eat my corn, and I'm always trying to plan to prevent that as much as I can. So the sunflowers worked out well. Also, they were just so beautiful. It was such a nice touch to have the backdrop of the sunflowers in the background. Like, I just feel like entering into my garden at that time when the sunflowers were blooming was just like the most beautiful visual experience. Also, the beans were able to grow up the sunflowers as well as the corn, so it provided even more staking for the beans, which was great. So I grew sunflowers the same way, corn the same way, beans the same way. The main thing that I changed was the squash, just decreased the number of squash plants, and then by proxy, the number of varieties of squash that I'm growing. I think that's pretty much it. So now I'm just gonna kind of take you through the process of planting it again, because I again filmed kind of my whole process and putting it in. So you can watch that now if you want. And if you want to watch my video from last year, that will have a lot more context for what the Three Sisters Garden is in terms of permaculture, history, that kind of thing. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so here is the new setup for the Three Sisters Garden that I'll be planting this year. I actually, a few pages prior, have my setup from last year. So if you watched my last video, you would have seen this diagram. Slight changes, so I'm using a different raised bed this year. So last year I used a raised bed where there's this giant rosemary bush taking up like the whole side of it. So then I just really had like this area of the bed to plant the Three Sisters Garden. This year I'm actually gonna do like the same amount of size, but obviously there's not like the big rosemary bush in this bed. I think I'm just gonna plant some other things over here, like maybe some zucchini, potentially like some broccoli or something like that. I'm not really sure. But this size actually worked really well. Like I don't really want that much bigger of a bed. I thought it was like a good amount. The major difference is I am planting way less squash, which again, if you watched my last year video, you saw that I knew this was gonna be a problem as soon as I did it. I knew that this was way too many squash, but I just did it anyway, and like only like 1 or 2 of them ended up even producing. So instead I'm just gonna space it out a lot more and just have the 3 squash plants. So yeah, I'm only gonna do 3 because I just like want them to actually have space to spread out. Last year they were just like way too overcrowded, but everything else is pretty much the same. Like I'm gonna do the mound of like 3 or 4 corns in one. That worked really well. They all like grew really well together, and then surround them with beans that I'm gonna start later. So I'm probably gonna start the bean seeds today as well, but then not put them in until the corn is like a little bit taller, because the beans grow super fast. So 3 to 4 corn in each corn mound, surrounded by a couple beans that will grow up the corn, and then a squash in between or on either side, and a back row of sunflowers. So very similar to what I did last year. It worked out really well. And then whatever leftover space I have here, I'm just gonna kind of fill it with whatever I need to fill it with for my seedlings. All right, yeah, I think that's all I have to share with the diagram, but yeah, not a ton of changes from last year, just fewer squash, and then slightly different orientation of the beds because I'm using a different bed this year. Cool. that's everything that I did this year. Hopefully this was interesting to you, especially if you watched my old video and just kind of seeing how I updated things for this year. Last year I ended my video with this whole like breakdown of my feelings about like the philosophy of permaculture ethics and how it fits into my spirituality and all this stuff. And I would say basically all of those things are still how I feel. I love that I'm carrying on this ancient tradition by planting this way. It's such a smart method as well, and I can totally see why it's lasted all these years, and it's such a big part of all these different agricultural traditions and cultures. There's different variations on the Three Sisters planting method for many different climates all around the Americas, and it's cool to kind of feel like I'm figuring out a planting method that now works for an urban setting, which is a relatively new in terms of like ancient timescales kind of setting. It's been a really cool way to connect more with traditional agricultural methods, as well as permaculture system design and just the land that I'm growing on in general. Highly recommend Three Sisters planting if you are considering it or you haven't done it. Hopefully this video was helpful, and I would love to hear any thoughts that you have in the comments. It's so cool to be able to share my gardening journey and hear other people's perspectives and what they do. So yeah, if you have any thoughts, please put them in the comments. I'd love to hear. But yeah, I think that's all I have. So thank you for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye.